Everything is falling down for you guys because people perceive you as bullies.
Blake Lively's lawyer has officially thrown in the towel, and honestly, who can even blame him?
The New York Times actively vouched for the veracity of its false narrative.
After months of fake claims, media stunts, and courtroom chaos, even he couldn't defend the circus anymore. This wasn't about justice. It was a full-blown PR meltdown, dragging innocent people and legal sanity straight into the trash.
We want all evidence to come out that's proper and appropriate evidence.
Imagine being so deep in your own fantasy world that your own lawyer throws up his hands, wipes the sweat from his forehead, and says, you know what? I'd rather represent a parking ticket, because that's exactly what just happened after months of legal theater that felt more like a scripted Netflix drama than a real lawsuit. Blake Lively's legal team just walked out, not eased out, not quietly resigned. They quit like they were escaping a sinking ship loaded with PR grenades, tantrums, and legal chaos.
You're not defined by anything any man has ever done to you or will ever do to you, that your identity is you and you define.
Let's talk about what pushed this legal professional over the edge. Blake, along with her ever so silent yet somehow always involved husband Ryan Reynolds, went full toddler in a toy store mode. In court, they weren't filing motions, they were flinging them. We're talking multiple Rule 11 sanctions, shameless attempts to quash subpoenas, and yes, of course, they dragged Taylor Swift's name into the mess like that was somehow going to solve anything. Spoiler alert. It didn't. It backfired so badly. The courtroom probably still smells like burnt reputation.
Want all evidence to come out that's proper and appropriate evidence.
And then came May 13th, mark that date, because that's when all hell broke loose. On paper, Ryan Friedman's team, aka the ones actually behaving like grown-ups in this circus, dropped an explosive letter that basically handed Blake and Ryan their egos on a silver platter. They called Blake's tactics legally frivolous and emotionally manipulative.
It's monstrous what she did, and she's got to pay for it.
Live birth.
When lawyers start describing legal strategies as toxic relationships, you know it's time to run. And that's exactly what Blake's team did. They didn't just quit, they rebelled. It was a loud, clapping exit from a woman who's turned the courtroom into her personal stage and expected applause.
I have to be a full-blown, I am sorry, I lied, I am a terrible person, tail in between the legs, and that's what we deserve.
Now here's where things get even more deliciously ridiculous. Back in April 2024, Blake and Ryan's legal team thought it would be cute to toss over a dozen motions into the mix. You read that right, 12+ motions, and 2 of them were sanctions requests.
Ways that narcissists attack their victims is by using the legal system to bully their opponents. So according to them, these are some of the common tactics you'll see of them.
One was filed by Blake's personal lawyer, the other by Ryan's personal pick, Michael Gottel, because God forbid he let his wife hog all the cringe moments to herself. These weren't well thought out legal arguments either. They were described, and I'm quoting insiders here, as literal copy-paste jobs.
Onto a prototype and said, I'm going to pump the brakes and see what happens. And then when Brian Friedman came back with the facts, they were just undeniable. You know, it was undeniable.
This avalanche of legal diarrhea came right after they got exposed for the Van Sham lawsuit. Yes, that fake stunt they tried to use as a backdoor attack on Justinbaldoni and the Wayfair folks. So how did Friedman's crew respond? They unleashed associate Ellen GOP on May 13th, and she went scorched earth in court filings. She called their motions improper, duplicative, and harassing. That's lawyer speak. Are y'all drunk? Because really, if you're going to weaponize the legal system, at least put some effort into it. Then they published 170 pages of perfectly documented texts and emails between all parties that basically show Blake as the aggressor. Here's the proof. And then, as if things weren't already flaming hot, court insiders revealed that Blake's legal team wasn't even trying to win anymore. They were just trying to dodge hearings. Yep, instead of actually showing up and arguing facts, they were manipulating Rule 11 procedures to sneak in victories by wearing the court down. One judge reportedly called it a drama queen routine, and I don't blame him. Blake turned courtroom filings into BuzzFeed articles. Her obsession with controlling the narrative was so intense, her own legal team started whispering about the internal pressure to push claims that made zero legal sense, but generated great headlines.
And they publish 170 pages of perfectly documented texts and emails between all the parties that basically show Blake to be the aggressor. Here's the
So now we hit the real kicker. The moment the dam broke, that same May 13th letter dropped a bomb. And not the fun fireworks kind. It exposed how Blake's legal team was pushing Rule 11 violations like candy at a party. They targeted people who had no legal standing in the case. Jamie, Heath, Melissa, Nathan Baldwin, just casually tossing names into the fire like it was a gossip column. Friedman's team clapped back, calling the sanctions demand Not just weak, but a straight-up weapon of harassment. Yes, that's an actual quote. And I don't know about you, but when a judge hears that your legal strategy is harassment dressed up in filing paper, things are definitely not going your way.
The whole point of a lawsuit is you just start with allegations, and allegations are not evidence. They're just statements of fact that help establish this is the claim that I'm bringing.
One of the biggest issues was that Blake's team was using something called group pleading, which is basically a lazy way of saying, we're blaming all of y'all, deal with it. It's legally sketchy and intellectually insulting, and the best part, even if it were a real problem, it's fixable. It's what they call a curable defect in court, not something you start flinging sanctions over, which makes Blake's strategy about as sound as her judgment in choosing co-defendants.
About her, I knew how she grew up. I knew that she kind of was one of these people. What tends to be the case is that when you grow up with everything, you create things out of nothing because you're looking for struggle in your life and you're used to getting whatever it is.
And while all this was happening, the silence from her legal team was deafening, not because they were quietly confident, but because they were getting grilled behind closed doors. They were being called out for letting Blake play the legal equivalent of whack-a-mole with subpoenas. She wanted gag orders slapped on critics, discovery silenced, and subpoenas dodged like it was a TikTok challenge, and her legal team just stood there, probably trying to remember how much student debt they were still paying off to deal with this disaster.
Is pure comedy and insanity. It literally contradicts itself, and it's not even admissible because of certain things.
When your own legal team starts quietly siding with the people you're suing and then just packs up and leaves, it's not just a red flag, it's a full-on red billboard with flashing lights and a siren. Blake Lively wasn't just a difficult client, she became a liability so massive her lawyers would rather risk working retail during tax season than file another motion on her behalf. This isn't how court works, this isn't how law works, and this sure as hell isn't how justice works, but it is exactly how Blake Lively works. Performative, petty, and completely out of touch with reality. And her lawyer, well, he finally got the memo.
I do not believe Blake Lively is that, but again, you can clearly see, in my opinion, the narcissism at bare minimum that's going on with her.
Let's get something straight. When a lawyer realizes he's not working on a lawsuit but starring in a deranged press release written by a fame-hungry actress who thinks Deadpool memes count as legal arguments, it's time to run. And Blake Lively's now former legal team ran like the building was on fire, and she was holding the match. This wasn't about law or justice or facts. This was about image control, press manipulation, narrative engineering, and the second her legal team realized they were defending a PR-addicted narcissist, they tapped out fast.
You guys were complicit here. You guys were involved in this every step of...
You'd think that after filing a ridiculous number of sanctions and blowing up over every subpoena, she'd eventually start focusing on actual evidence. But nope, according to people close to the team, Blake and her lovable legal sidekick Ryan Reynolds actually asked their attorneys to include tweets, tabloid headlines, and yes, Deadpool jokes in official court filings. I'm not kidding, this woman genuinely thought a superhero punchline would be persuasive in a federal courtroom we're now living in an age where Blake Lively's legal strategy is completely indistinguishable from a BuzzFeed quiz.
False accusations forces the opponent to be on the defensive and causes the court system to frown when the opponent makes a similar charge against the narcissist. Do you see that? So they've already said, we're going to file sanctions for a Van Sham lawsuit, and your attorneys are acting unethically, and you have filed a frivolous lawsuit against us. That's what Wayfair has.
But wait, it gets better. One of the actual filings submitted to court included a section where Blake's team questioned whether Disney was complicit in Ryan using shareholder revenues for a personal grudge. Yeah, apparently this lawsuit wasn't dramatic enough. So they decided to drag Disney into it too, like Mickey Mouse was secretly in a boardroom plotting Ryan's courtroom revenge. They even tried to argue that a pool scene in Deadpool and Wolverine, yes, a literal movie clip, was somehow evidence that Ryan mocked Justinbaldoni because, of course, when your legal argument has no leg to stand on, you start quoting superhero movies and pretending it's testimony.
Yeah, and again, at the same time, Nathan assembled a team that could dominate social media through full social account takedowns by starting threads of theories and...
Hold that thought.
Here we go. Generally working to change the narrative. So it's impossible to know how much they planted and how much of it originated organically. Well, wait a minute.
The lawyers were done, mentally, spiritually, legally done. One source said it best, this wasn't legal strategy. It was a PR stunt gone rogue. The legal team had signed on for a lawsuit, not a cinematic universe. Blake Lively wasn't trying to win in court. She was trying to trend on Twitter. She didn't want to submit evidence. She wanted to submit vibes. And her lawyers, bless their broken spirits, finally realized they weren't defending a client. They were ghostwriting for a walking press release with a god complex. And then came the clapback of the century. Ryan Friedman, cool as ever, filed a legal nuke that dismantled Blake's circus from top to bottom. He refused to play into her baiting tactics and instead delivered what can only be described as a surgical takedown. His response shredded Blake's entire motion and accused her of manufacturing drama purely for media play. That one line alone probably made Blake's lawyer consider a different career path. Maybe yoga, maybe goat farming. Anything but this. Even the judge wasn't having it. Blake's request to sanction Friedman was completely denied, ruled legally hollow, just like the claims she's been parading around since day one. And to make it even worse, the court actually warned her team that their repeated attempts to silence critics bordered on First Amendment violations. Yes, that's how far gone Blake was. She wasn't just trying to win a lawsuit anymore. She was trying to gag anyone who didn't write nice things about her online at that point. Her lawyer had seen enough. Word is he flat out refused to sign any more filings unless Blake's entire strategy changed, which of course it didn't, because why adjust when you can triple down on your own delusion, right? Rather than scale back the insanity, Blake just kept charging forward like she genuinely believed she was the misunderstood protagonist in a courtroom rom-com, except no one was laughing, not even her own team.
Senseless motions and hearings in order to delay the process. They will file senseless motions, excessive hearings, and multiple postponements. This is again done to drain the financial resources of the opponent and create an atmosphere of the never-ending life.
Behind the scenes, it was even uglier. Sources inside her legal circle say the team started cracking under pressure, not from the case itself, but from Blake's total disregard for legal ethics. Remember when she tried to subpoena Taylor Swift's phone records? Yeah, that was from a fake lawsuit, not a real one, a fabricated legal stunt meant to dig into personal data and leak it later. That wasn't a slip-up, that was a weaponized abuse of process, and her lawyers were not okay with it. The tension got so bad that even Michael Gottle's own sanctions filing was rejected by his firm partners because they said it was redundant and emotionally driven. You heard that right? Even the people who work for him were like, hey man, this is unhinged, chill. It wasn't about justice, it was about revenge headlines and emotional outbursts wrapped in legal jargon. And just when you think this circus couldn't add another act, it did. Apparently Blake was so obsessed with looking stronger than Baldoni that she treated court filings like Instagram captions. I wish that was a joke. She literally demanded rewrites of motions to make herself look like the boss babe of the year in legal text. Can you imagine being a Harvard-educated lawyer and being told to make this motion sound more empowering? Because that's exactly what was happening.
They keep going to the court so that they can get ahead of things, so that when Baldoni and Wayfair do respond, the court looks at them like they're crazy.
And then there's Leslie Sloan, a publicist who apparently thought she was a lawyer. At one point, she was reportedly reviewing court documents before they were even finalized. Yes, the PR manager had more influence over legal filings than the actual lawyers. Because when you're Blake Lively, why listen to legal experts when you have a publicist with a Wi-Fi connection and a Pinterest board titled Courtroom Chic?
Was quite horrific, because you just go, what kind of a monster even goes through with this CRD filing? Like, they're basically bullying him again in the law.
Let's just call it like it is. The lawyers didn't quit the case, they quit her. They quit the Instagram strategy, the drama, the lies, the fake lawsuits, the Deadpool jokes, the Taylor Swift subpoenas, the tabloid-level tantrums. They quit the ego trip. She called a lawsuit and walked away with whatever dignity they had left. Blake Lively wanted legal warriors. She got crisis managers with law degrees who finally said enough.
Justinbaldoni is suing him, Blake Lively, and their PR person, Leslie Sloan, for $400 million.
Blake Lively's legal nightmare has officially become a masterclass in self-destruction, a spectacle of hubris and chaos that reads more like a cautionary tale than a lawsuit. Behind the glossy headlines and social media optics, the reality was far uglier, far messier, and far more humiliating than anyone could have imagined. By the time her legal team started abandoning ship, Blake wasn't just losing a court case. She was collapsing under the weight of her own ego, her own obsession with narrative control, and her total inability to distinguish law from PR theater. The lawyers didn't quit the case. They quit Blake herself, walked away from the endless Instagram-inspired motions, the Deadpool jokes, the subpoenas targeting Taylor Swift, and the absurd attempts to weaponize Rule 11 sanctions. They quit the performative tantrums, the press manipulations, and the relentless attempts to turn every procedural filing into a headline. They were supposed to be legal experts, professionals trained to navigate a complex legal system, yet they found themselves ghostwriting for a walking press release with a god complex, endlessly revising motions to make Blake appear like the heroic protagonist in her own delusional courtroom drama. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't advocacy. It was a public meltdown masquerading as legal process, and the moment the lawyers realized they were no longer defending a client, but fueling a PR-obsessed narcissist, they bolted. And good for them, because the spectacle had become unbearable. Imagine the scene. Filings littered with tweets, tabloid excerpts, and even superhero punchlines. Yes, Blake literally instructed her lawyers to quote Deadpool jokes in court documents, convinced somehow that witty one-liners would sway a federal judge. Even the most seasoned legal professionals were left dumbfounded, watching as motions and briefs were treated less like legal instruments and more like BuzzFeed quizzes, complete with dramatic captions and Instagram-worthy phrasing. Meanwhile, Ryan Reynolds, who somehow maintained his public persona of calm and humor throughout, was dragged into this whirlwind whether he liked it or not. His name peppered every motion, every filing, and even SNL jokes entered as evidence, blending the worlds of pop culture and jurisprudence in ways that left the courtroom struggling to differentiate reality from spectacle. Legal experts inside the case began raising serious questions. Did Ryan misuse Disney's shareholder money to fund these PR-driven attacks on Justinbaldoni? The possibility of SEC-level scrutiny loomed, because dipping into corporate funds to settle personal vendettas is exactly the kind of financial misstep that turns headlines into formal investigations. And then there were the Deadpool and Wolverine pool clips, which Blake's team bizarrely tried to pass off as evidence of Ryan mocking Baldoni, even while he was supposedly defending his wife's alleged emotional trauma. It was surreal. A courtroom filled with motions, subpoenas, and pleadings that looked less like legal arguments and more like a Hollywood set, complete with staged punchlines and cinematic cutaways. Judges, unsurprisingly, weren't impressed. Repeatedly, they called out Blake's obsessive misuse of Rule 11, noting that her attempts to sanction innocent parties were desperate reruns of arguments that had already failed. They recognized her motions as desperate, performative exercises in narrative manipulation, a show of ego dressed up in legal paper, desperate to reassert control in a case that had already spun completely out of her hands. Blake didn't just target the right people. She dragged completely uninvolved figures into her legal maelstrom. Jamie Heath, Melissa Nathan, and even high-ranking WME executives suddenly found themselves named in her lawsuit, their alleged crimes boiling down to the simple fact of being near Justinbaldoni. There was no evidence, no nuance, just the blind toss of names into her legal dumpster fire, hoping to manufacture drama and relevance. And when even minor clerical errors were pointed out by Wayfair's attorneys as curable defects rather than correct them, Blake doubled down, demanding sanctions and turning trivial, fixable mistakes into a full-blown courtroom crisis. Her lawyers, under pressure and bewildered, reportedly whispered to each other about the absurdity of what they were being asked to do, caught in the impossible position of defending actions that defied law, ethics, and reason. The tension reached such heights that even Michael Gottel, filing on Ryan's behalf, had motions rejected by his own firm for being redundant and emotionally driven, a sign that the internal chaos had overtaken professional judgment. And then there was Leslie Sloan, Blake's publicist, who somehow positioned herself as a quasi-legal consultant, reviewing and influencing filings before the lawyers even finalized them. In a sane world, legal counsel would guide PR, not the other way around, but in Blake's world, social media optics and narrative control trumped legal expertise at every turn. By May 13th, the culmination of these missteps was exposed in full, with letters from Ryan Friedman's team laying bare the fragility of Blake's legal circus. Her tactics were called frivolous, duplicative, and harassing, her motions shredded, her attempts to silence critics flagged as potential First Amendment violations. The lawyers who had tolerated her delusions finally walked away, refusing to submit another filing until her strategy radically changed, a change that, of course, never came. Instead, she continued charging forward like a protagonist in her own imaginary courtroom rom-com, insisting that motions be rewritten to make her appear powerful, in control, and heroic, blind to the reality that her credibility had evaporated and that she was rapidly losing the support of the people who had once been her allies. Meanwhile, the courts, the public, and even her colleagues were watching as Blake weaponized the legal system not to seek justice, but revenge. Every filing, every subpoena, every motion became an exercise in ego-driven spectacle, dragging innocent parties through her personal vendetta. And the irony was staggering. While Blake's reputation and career crumbled under the weight of her own delusions, Justinbaldoni's public image strengthened. He stood firm, fought back effectively, and emerged with Hollywood rallying to his side. Ryan Reynolds, for his part, played a delicate game of distance and PR misdirection, keeping a veneer of calm while his wife's actions threatened to engulf them both in legal and reputational peril. Deadpool jokes, Marvel references, tabloid headlines, and Instagram-ready motions couldn't mask the chaos. They only amplified it, turning the courtroom into a theater of absurdity. Judges denied her sanctions requests, laughed out motions, and warned her team that their conduct bordered on misuse of legal procedure. Every step Blake took to control the narrative backfired, making her look smaller, less credible, and dangerously out of touch with reality. By the time the dust settled, her lawyers had abandoned her, the judge had seen through the charade, and the public had witnessed an unparalleled collapse of a carefully curated image. Blake Lively had weaponized the legal system for revenge, dragged innocent parties into chaos, and turned a lawsuit into a media spectacle, only to watch her credibility evaporate. Ryan Reynolds, caught in the storm, emerged cautious and calculating, navigating the fallout with a careful hand. Taylor Swift, never directly involved but tangentially dragged into the case, remained silently untouchable, highlighting the stark contrast between those who played by the rules and those who let ego dictate action. In the end, the courtroom had already rendered its judgment. Independent of official rulings, Blake's strategy was a failure, her credibility shattered, and her attempt to control both the law and the narrative exposed for the spectacle it truly was. Every move, every filing, every desperate attempt to rewrite perception crumbled under scrutiny, leaving behind a cautionary tale of ego, delusion, and public humiliation that would be remembered long after the headlines faded.